It's now my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Yuri Quintana. Yuri is Director of Global Health Informatics in the Division of Clinical Informatics of the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center at Harvard University, and he's an Assistant Professor of Medicine at the Harvard Medical School. His research is focused on developing innovative technologies and systems that empower communities of healthcare professionals, patients, and families. He's developed award-winning global online and mobile collaboration networks that have had a transformational impact in pediatrics and cancer care. Yuri was a principal investigator in the HealNet network of centers of excellence, also headquartered here at McMaster University in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and served as director of the New Media Research Lab at Western University in London, Ontario. And he's also held high-tech positions at IBM and Wacom. Yuri has kindly offered to share his expertise with us today to better familiarize us with different approaches to biomedical informatics and innovations in big data platforms for biomedical research. We look forward to his insights and advice today. Welcome, Yuri.
Thank you very much, Diana and Marshall. And it's a pleasure to be with you here today to share some of the innovations that I'm doing with colleagues, not only here at Harvard, but around the world. I'm very excited to also be part of this network seminar series. I myself got my start in an NCE that was also led by Diana Royce and others out of McMaster on evidence-based medicine. So I have a very dear affection for all the great work that emanates out of Canada and the great impact that it's had globally. So thank you, Diana, for the invitation. Today I'm going to be talking about bioinformatics and its potential for discovery and how it can advance our collaborations worldwide. So why do we need bioinformatics? Well, let's start first by looking at some of the challenges that we have in healthcare. One of the things that is to note is that chronic diseases are rapidly expanding all over the world. And not only they are increasing, the cost of dealing with chronic diseases is increasing at an astronomical rate and will be almost 48% of GDP in the next few years. Respiratory diseases and allergies are a major contributing cause of these conditions. We also see that there is also movement of people within countries, and across continents. And so we have a growing diversity of genetics in the patient population pool. Unfortunately, most research that has been funded has been in high-income countries, and hence the research has been more biased towards the genetics of people in those countries. And so as we have a growing population of diversity, we will need to find better ways to understand how genetics can help us develop better treatments. We also know that evidence-based medicine plays an important part, and as I mentioned, I got started in the HealNet network in Canada, putting evidence to work in application. But as we found both in Canada and the US and other countries, that evidence alone isn't enough. Implementing them in a way that can reduce errors is very difficult. And as we start to try to translate research into bedside treatments, that process can take up to 17 years. And so we need better ways to sort of communicate and do translational research. And so not only do we need better data and better, but we also need better learning networks and better ways to collaborate across different disciplines and across countries. So how do we actually do that? Well, one of the challenges that we have is that many places, hospitals and research centers and universities have incomplete data for any one particular disease. And this is partly not only because of number of patients you have, but also the difficulties in collecting data, interoperability, and data sharing. Also, a lot of centers who are developing genomic data are finding it increasingly challenging to link that clinical data with genomic data. And then to try to do it across institutions and across countries becomes a lot harder. And we'll be looking at ways in which we can tackle this in the next few moments. We also find that a lot of centers don't collect family history or environmental history. And increasingly, as we want to optimize treatment, these will play an increasingly important role. So in order to go beyond what we've done up to now, we're going to need to be able to develop personalized treatments by tailoring them to genetics, the clinical and family history, and environmental factors. And to do this, we're going to have to be able to collect vast amounts of data, integrate it, and make it accessible and usable. So what is bioinformatics? Well, bioinformatics is an interdisciplinary field that develops analytical methods and software tools for understanding clinical and biological data. It combines elements from many fields, including basic sciences, biology, computer science, mathematics, and engineering, and many more. And there have been several books over the last 20 years and journals that have developed in this field. The field actually begins in the 60s, and one of the earliest sets of clinical computing actually started around 1967 and became operational in the early 70s. Our founder of our division was one of the first ones to have implemented that, Warner Slack and Harold Bleich here at Harvard Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. And in other centers across the United States and Canada, many of these systems expanded not only within hospitals, but increasingly trying to reach into the home. So we saw consumer health innovations, telehealth. We started creating more advanced ways of collecting data at a regional and national level, and that has become a field of itself called public health informatics. And going the other way in terms of basic science, we've also developed more advanced ways of collecting research data and linking that to clinical informatics. And that has led to an area known as research informatics. So there are many, within biomedical informatics, there are many related fields which overlap. And if we look at some of the applications that have been developed, we see that increasingly that there are many such systems across these different areas, both in the clinic, at home, at a population level, or in the laboratories or research centers. And so the challenge is, how do you take data from these different systems, integrate it, and make it available in a way that you can actually analyze and create longitudinal studies? Well, there have been several key developments that have happened at many centers. Some of the things that have been developed at my center here, Division of Clinical Informatics, have been one of the first ways of collecting data directly from patients. And actually this happened in 1967. And the first photo you see there is Warner Slack. Today we celebrate 50 years to the day when they wrote an article in the national press, and he was on national TV, explaining how it would be beneficial to collect data directly from patients, thus freeing the doctors to be able to do more advanced work and have a richer family history of that. And it's ironic that 50 years today, we're still trying to implement this vision, but we've made progress. We've also developed some of the first ways to link to literature data, and this for biomedical research is very important. As you're looking at clinical data, be able to pull up the relevant clinical studies and analytical tools. So PaperChase was developed here and eventually contributed to the development of PubMed. We also developed some of the first medical record systems, but equally important, we've also developed ways to connect patients to their babies in NICUs, patients to their own medical record with Patient Site, and more recently with InfoSage, being able to link elders with their family members who are caring for them through online and mobile networks. And we believe very much in this center that families and patients can play a very important part in providing necessary data to get a more complete, accurate picture of the healthcare landscape and produce not only better treatments, but better research. So why is it so difficult to collect all this data? Well, in part is because there's a lot of data, and there's also lots of different ways to classify that data and organize it. So the problem isn't that there aren't standards. The problem is that there's too many standards, and we can't quite always agree on which standard. And even within a standard, there's different ways of implementing the codification of data within that standard. There's also highly incomplete data, and so no center has a complete medical history of any one patient. So we're dealing with highly fragmented data, codified at different levels of accuracy, usually distributed across multiple healthcare systems. And as we develop research databases, we have to de-identify that data, and it's very difficult to completely de-identify data. So there are different degrees of de-identification. Here you see a nice framework developed by the Future of Privacy Forum that shows different approaches of de-identifying and degrees of it. And so one of the big pushes that has happened in bioinformatics has really been the advancement of technologies that allow us to analyze the human genome. And there was a major initiative in the United States as well as several other countries in the 1990s and early 2000s, which really for the first time mapped the human genome for the first time, at least a first draft of it, which enabled further analysis. And as these technologies become more advanced, we're able to analyze these data at a more deeper level. So not only at the DNA level, but then down to the proteins. And so you see a bunch of technologies such as DNA sequencers, DNA microarrays, and mass spectrometers that are creating tremendous amounts of data. And each year there is a new generation of data with more granular data. And so the challenge is to not only how to manage this data, but to be able to integrate data that has been analyzed at different levels of complexity with different generations of technology. And the price of this technology continues to drop dramatically. And so we're going to see even more data. So the problem is that we don't have data. The question is how to analyze that. So let's move to platforms and networks that are trying to do just that. There has been quite a bit of talk by a group here in the United States and other groups around the world, the Institute of Medicine, and now it's called the National Academies, to develop something called the learning healthcare system. And I'm working in this area, but at a global level. And this really tries to have a continuous cycle where we analyze data, we develop methodologies for treatment, we deploy it at local centers, we learn from that data, we discuss the data not only locally, but then aggregate that data and then give that back into the community. And as a community, pool our knowledge and be able to learn from that and develop a new generation of treatments. And while this has been going on for many decades, how to operationalize this at a large scale, even within an institution or across institution, becomes quite challenging. And so what you need is very good technologies for being able to share data and train and educate people on the methodologies for doing this. I spent 12 years at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, developing tools and platforms for pediatric cancer. Two of the big tools that I was part of leading the development was cureforkids.org, a global platform for sharing education and shared protocols, and a data collection tool called Pond for Kids that allowed clinical protocols to be shared and data to be collected from different centers, aggregated, and analyzed in de-anonymized formats. Several collaboration networks, in fact, 400 different groups formed, and over 200 of those were clinically oriented, developing shared protocols. And over those 12 years, many of the countries were able to raise their survival rates by 20 or 30 or more percent in their area. So collaboration is essential, not only in developing countries, but also developed countries. The development of these platforms is very difficult. About the same period that I was building Cure for Kids and Pond, another initiative called CA Big was developed in the United States. Millions of dollars were spent on this. Unfortunately, there were a lot of individual tools that were state of the art, but the integration of these tools did not work very well. And so after many years, in 2011, they decided to discontinue this platform because there was just not enough coherence in the system. And so this is sort of a lesson learned in that the design of this has to be done in a way such that there is seamless integration of the tools. More recently, the American Society for Clinical Oncology has developed CancerLink, which is trying to do similar things such as Pond for kids, in that it's sharing clinical data from various centers and being able to aggregate that and be able to create a learning system within oncology here in the United States. I more recently have been developing something called Alicanto, which is a learning system that combines both education and access to clinical tools for collaboration. And this tool essentially tries to create a seamless environment where you can have access to all the education and the data in one center and create online communities where people can meet online, discuss and share and develop their protocols or their research projects together. And so the problem isn't that there aren't individual technologies to do this. The problem is that they're usually fragmented, and it's very frustrating to learn 10 different systems to be able to participate in your research community. So this is an integrated system. There are 2 networks that have launched in the last 2 years. One is called Open Pediatrics with Boston Children's Hospital, which has over 20,000 users already, and a growing amount of educational content and online groups that meet. And the more recently launched MadCap network out of Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, that is a collaboration of many institutes here in the United States, England, and universities in Africa. And this is studying the genomic basis of prostate cancer to develop new advanced research. And I'm very excited for both networks because both of them involve high degrees of collaboration and global data sharing. There are some tools that have been developed to advance the sharing of genomic data. One of the more famous one is I2Me2, developed here at Harvard and with other colleagues across the United States, and a more global initiative called Transmart. These two have now sort of merged, and this allows you to share lots of clinical data and create ways to aggregate that and share it among different groups and install analytical data. There are several organizations that have been formed using the Transmart platform. One of the largest one is ETRIX, funded by the European Union, which is a combination of both universities and private sector pharma companies working to aggregate data and work together on biomedical discoveries. There are also large data sets that are becoming available for sharing and advancing research. One of them is the NIH Genomic Data Commons, which is available online. We also see things such as the biobanking resource developed in Europe, which has several member countries, and they're developing electronic informatic tools as well as creating databases that are shareable. Here in the United States, there is several initiatives for creating repositories for data. So after large clinical studies end, there isn't a really convenient place to archive that data and make it available for reuse. So several initiatives are underway. One of them is the Big Data to Knowledge initiative, funded by the National Institute of Health here, and they have a growing repository, and they're working very hard to come up with ways to data curate this and index the content so that it makes it more easy for people to integrate it into other repositories for reuse. Genomics England has a large initiative as well, and you'll see here that they're putting, like many other groups, a lot of emphasis on how you curate the data, validate it, and classify it in a way that can be used by others. The Emerge network has been funded here in the United States. That also has several hospitals working together to create shared DNA biorepositories that are linked to clinical histories from the electronic medical record. And there are several initiatives underway using that data. More recently, there has been an initiative here called All of Us, led by former Vice President Joe Biden. And this is trying to create a cohort of 1 million people of diverse backgrounds here in the United States, not only to look at the clinical history, but look at the environmental history, lifestyle, and biology, and to combine these 3 factors to be able to create a more rich resource for cancer research. The U.S. Veterans Affairs has a very large program as well of trying to collect DNA from their members, and several clinical studies have been created. One of the challenges, even though that many of them use the VISTA medical record system, is that they're migrating to Cerner, and even each implementation of VISTA is slightly different. And so they have been facing, like many other people, the challenges of how to aggregate data. And in China, there's a very large, there's more than one, but this is one of them, BGI, which is developing a large research center and creating a large gene bank being used for advanced clinical research. So how do you build these networks? These are very large networks and require a large number of people. Here are some of the roles that you need to have within these networks: chief scientists. You need a research informatics director that understands how the information needs to be organized in a way that can advance the research. You need someone also on the clinical side that understands integration from the clinical side, and both of these need to actually coexist. You need a biomedical platforms architect that can bring these two sides, the life sciences and the clinical side, together. You need programmers and engineers, of course. Key to that is people with deep understanding of taxonomies and classification. You need a very good team for assuring the quality of the data. And then once you're able to assemble that data, then you need data scientists, machine learning experts, to be able to create the analytical tools. Very key is also good people that know how to create good user interfaces. Some of these systems are very powerful in terms of functionality, but very difficult to use. And so typically these networks don't put enough energy or funding towards usability of these tools. And it's important to have good ethics and privacy directors that communicate both internally, but also to your stakeholders and patients and the public, to know that there's trust in how the data is being used, archived, and secure. To do this, you need to have continuous training, and you need a very strong set of cybersecurity experts, cloud computing, and to be able to sustain it, you'll need an external partnerships director. So as you see, there are many different roles, and this is just a partial list. And to do this, you need to have a fairly long view and be able to hire the right skill sets. What are the challenges in trying to bring this to life? Well, part of it sometimes is that some of these networks lack of focus. They try to do too much too quickly, and so they're feature rich but function poor. Lots of features, but none of the features actually are at a great enough depth. So you need to have an initial focus that allows you to achieve a certain level of initial success and to be able to scale. As you see, there are a lot of complex skills that are needed, so you need a very highly trained personnel that's multidisciplinary. You need good governance that respects all the different disciplines and can create a cohesive environment, and that requires strong leadership. Funding is a problem because it's a lot, but it's usually not the biggest problem. My feeling is usually it's the people problem, being able to get the right combination of team that can work together. It's important to be able to collect consents up front, and especially if it's going to be shared with people outside of the network, and be able to get permissions to be able to reuse that data. And there has to be strong data use agreements between institutions. One of the things that's often been overlooked is the diversity of patient sets, which makes the findings limited to the type of diversity that you have in your gene pool. There has to be an agreement of what are the taxonomies and classification to collect it. This is one of the major challenges of trying to integrate data from different sources. So there has to be a roadmap to be able to do that. And as I mentioned before, the de-identification of information is important. It's never completely fully identified because there are ways to sort of be able to identify, especially with rare diseases. So there has to be a very clear level to do that. And more importantly, as important as anything else, is the sustainable model. And so if you're looking to be able to partner with pharma and other groups and be able to extend that has to be right part of the initial design, everything from consent to how this data is stored, especially where you're storing data from multiple countries. In some cases, some data sets must remain in a country because of national law. So then you need a distributed cloud architecture to be able to do that. So there are many places where you can get training on this. There are graduate programs in bioinformatics, clinical informatics, and bioengineering. Unfortunately, there aren't enough of these programs to feed the growing demand that there is in this, because it's as you saw, a global need for this, and it takes quite a bit of time to graduate people from these programs, and it's hard to keep faculty in these programs because there's a great demand to move to the private sector as well. There are some great societies such as the American Medical Informatics Society and IEEE that have many journals and conferences in this area. And there's a growing number of specialty boards that you can now have. In the United States, there's now a clinical informatics specialty board that is fairly new, and you can specialize in that. There's also one for nursing, and then there are other ones for imaging informatics as well as health information management. So I think it's important to seek people who have those or to send people to these programs. And we're very much of the belief in my division and many other places that education is really the cornerstone of the success of programs, because you need not only a good base of knowledge, but you need to keep up with this. And so we're very much involved in training both here at our university as well as on international projects. So what's a roadmap to be able to achieve some of these things? Well, first, I think you need to have some key leaders that understand the global landscape and challenges involved and the kind of needs you're going to need in terms of planning and assembling a strong multidisciplinary team. You need to, I think, also involve patients as true partners from the beginning and not halfway through, because they'll offer you insight into research questions that they're actually concerned on, but also advice on how they like to be respected and how their data is being collected. I think you need to start focused with a plan that's feasible initially, but is designed to scale both in data and the ability for you to answer a wide range of research questions. And above all, I think you need to have a very clear transparency, both internally and externally, about what you're doing with this data, so that everyone is supportive of what you're doing. So here are some references to some of the things. I think the slides will be available afterwards, both in bioinformatics, sources for training, and some of the data networks as well, and some definitions to the related fields that are increasingly overlapping and all contributing towards developing this. So as hard as this is, I'm an optimist, and I think in the next few years, we're going to see more and more of these networks. And as we have a richer data set, I think this will not only benefit high-income countries, but hopefully will partner with developing countries as well as true partners and help develop a new generation of researchers, both here in our countries, but around the world. Thank you very much. Back to you, Diana.
Thank you, Yuri, for that gallop through Bioinformatics 101. That was extremely informative and very eye-opening for me, for sure. This is the time that we open the floor to questions from today's webinar attendees, and I would encourage you to take advantage of Yuri's expertise during this period of time. So your questions can relate to the topic of his talk, Informatics Platforms for Big Data in Health Research, but Yuri also invites you to ask questions about his broader areas of interest, including mobile health apps, wearable technology, sensor-based applications for patient-reported data, serious games for health and wellness, and the implementation of online networks connecting patients, families, and researchers. So I'm going to kick off. Yuri, this is obviously a very expensive undertaking. You mentioned that there's projects that have invested $1 billion and then they didn't work out. But in terms of starting small so that you can scale your project to a national or a global level, what are the 3 most important things to get right before you start to scale? So if you were just starting a bioinformatics platform of data from a research project, for example, what are those core things that you have to work the kinks out of before you can actually scale?
So I think one of the key things is first to agree on an initial research focus. And having been part of an NCE, I know that it's sometimes difficult when you have a very large number of researchers who have diverse points of view. And I think given, getting funding from any research agency is highly competitive, and these are expensive initiatives. I think having an initial research focus that allows you to implement something well, but with the knowledge that you're going to expand to other types of data and other types of research questions, I think is important. I've seen this done well, and I've seen it done poorly as well, where in some cases the focus hasn't expanded and they've lost people within the network because they weren't interested on that, or people who started too broad and weren't able to achieve any level of success. So that's a judgment call initially of what is the initial focus, but having some transparency of what the roadmap is becomes important. I think the second part of it is starting to have an agreement on data formats and standards and coding, because the data will come in lots of different classification methods, and aggregating is always painful, but there has to be sort of a roadmap of how to make that easier as you move forward. And so that might mean that certain centers might need to start classifying content in additional ways. That doesn't mean they have to stop how they've done certain things, but to make it easier to do that. So having an agreement on those taxonomies and classification and budgeting time and having the patience to go through that, I think is important. If you don't do that well, then it's very difficult, if not impossible, to actually merge your data. And then I think there has to be a fairly transparent way of what are the benefits for these networks going to be, and how those benefits are going to be shared. And those benefits include in part publication. And so I think in networks that I've seen done very well, there's clear agreement at the beginning of how projects will agree to authorship. In the MadCap network, one of the things I like the most is how well and respectful the whole process has been, and how they treat the African colleagues as true peers and co-authors, and there's a long-term commitment to develop their skill sets as investigators and give them leadership opportunities. So I think having that transparency, whether it's publication, economic, intellectual property. I think sometimes institutions get very aggressive in trying to secure intellectual property rights and income streams and things like that. And if everyone gets too rigid about that, you'll never be able to get to a point where you can actually collaborate and get the broader benefits. So having a transparency and having flexibility at the institutional level to create these multi-institutional organizations. And I think both at a people level and an institution level, you quickly realize who are the true collaborators and who are the people that are really maybe are best to work alone. And so it takes a certain personality both at the individual, organization, and institutional level to be able to create these networks. But truly, if you want to tackle some of the big questions, you're going to have to, you'll need access to larger data sets, and that requires collaboration beyond your own institution.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So Marshall, do we have any questions?
We do indeed. We have 4 questions. All of them have been submitted in writing, so I'll read them out. Starting with the first, which comes from Dean Beethus, who wrote, "You mentioned industrial partnerships. Can you speak to the challenges involved and to some of the successes that have occurred in this area?" And that's the question.
Okay, so this is for many universities, it's a challenge in that, you know, the basic premise at a university is centers around academic freedom, and the corporations have a mandate to, you know, maximize shareholder value, which is sort of a competitive edge over that. And so there tends to be sometimes this difficult divide of, you know, how do you balance openness versus the need to protect income streams. Increasingly, I think companies are realizing that even though there are multi-billion-dollar pharmaceuticals, that they don't have all the data they need, nor the expertise to be able to analyze it. And so I think there's been a change over the last 10 years in a growing number of companies that are willing to enter in collaborative agreements with universities and to be able to share income streams and publication and other. So I think it's important for universities to maintain their integrity and transparency and lack of bias. I think it works better when there are multiple companies involved in a consortium with multiple universities, in that there's more of an even playing field for all the stakeholders involved. But I think above all, I think if there's a high degree of transparency, high degree of research ethics, it is achievable. I think some Europeans have been able to achieve this better than in the U.S., but in the U.S. there's more activity. Finally, I think both sides have to sort of be able to get accustomed to each other, because there is a different personality between both organizations, but I think there's a growing movement to create those. And I think so long as there's a high degree of transparency, I think it'll be done very well.
Okay, thank you for that question, Dean, and thank you for the answer. Next question, Marshall.
The next question comes from Amrit Singh, who wrote, which programming languages are most commonly used in bioinformatics? Python, R, Java, C++? And how useful is it to have a web development background? Full stack, Node.js, Django, etc.
So the answer is yes. So they're all used. There is a very rapid development of new tools. 10 years ago, R really wasn't in the scene. Now it's and Python, and both of those are now major forces in the area. 10 years from now, there'll be new tools as well. So I think today, definitely all the ones you mentioned are important. I think it depends on where your passion is and where you want to sort of spend your time. And because different tools do different things better. For example, some are better at the analysis. So certainly if you're into the analytical outcomes, R and other tools are particularly important. There are, if you're more interested in the infrastructure part of it, then full stack, and those become more important. The development of these systems are so large that really there's a great space. One area that is pretty weak is sort of good user interfaces. So if you're looking for a niche area, that will be increasingly valuable. I've seen lots of products sort of both commercial and institutional never reached their potential because people couldn't figure out the interfaces and be able to understand. And one other thing is sort of workflow, which I didn't mention, but how you go curating the data from one set to another requires a set of tools to be able to do that. So really, you have to sort of look at where your passion is in that. Try a few different things, and then see where you want to spend your time, and then be willing to sort of continually keep up. There's a new generation of databases, NoSQL, for example, with it's a different type of architecture for large data sets, and so that's another area that is also very high in demand, high performance database architectures as well, and in-memory databases.
Great. Amrit, thank you for that question. Yuri, thank you for the answer. Marshall, next question.
The next comment and question comes from Eduardo Reyes Serratos, who wrote, wonderful talk. At the beginning of your talk, you spoke briefly about how the flow of different populations and how they are distributed in the world. Given that the world is becoming more multicultural, I want to know if you have any thoughts on collecting clinical data from populations where, 1, access to medical care is difficult, and 2, access by medics to databases is a challenge given that they may not have the necessary training to handle them.
Yeah, so that's a great question. That's very dear to my heart. I think, you know, outside of high academic medical centers within the G8 countries, there's a challenge to get good detailed data. So the academic medical hospitals and research centers have, they're both a hospital and a research center, and so they have large amounts of staff to collect more degrees of data. But the population is, not all living near an academic medical center, and so you get vast numbers of people that are underrepresented in most studies. So even in the United States and Canada, for example, Indigenous, Native Americans, and Canadian First Nations people, Hispanics have been traditionally underrepresented. And then as you start to go globally into Africa and Asia, they are even more difficult. Now, the positive thing is that the technologies for collecting data, analyzing, and even doing screening is becoming increasingly less expensive. And so I think what needs to happen is that we need to start developing training in these other countries so that people in bioinformatics and best practices in data and collection and analysis. And that's sort of one of the things that MatCap is doing, and that the data is being collected in countries, and there's a strong educational component. I think when we do that, then we start treating our international partners as true peers and partners, rather than parachuting in when we have a grant, collect sample data, and then leave all the equipment behind. So many countries have felt quite burned by these previous studies where, some genetic data for a particular interest has been collected, but there has been no long-term planning. And so increasingly there are more research groups that are trying to develop a more sustained vision for how to do that research. And I would encourage governments and people that write into their grants the need to be able to allocate more funding, sustainable funding for international projects, because by helping others, you're helping yourself, but you're also helping them. And I think it's the humanitarian way to do it. It's clear that by the increasing migration of populations through refugees or through natural immigration, we are going to have a higher diversity of genetic pool in most cities around the world. So I think it becomes really important. And I think tied to that is sort of responsible conduct to be able to educate patients, especially people who are illiterate or low literate, to be able to understand why what they're contributing their data to. And so I think including social scientists and anthropologists to be able to do this in an ethically proper way is important. So I think this is a key area that more people should be focused on, and I'm an optimist. I think there will be more people involved in this type of work.
Thank you, Yuri. That's a great example of why the team itself needs to be multidisciplinary, so these different perspectives can be taken into account. Eduardo, thanks for asking that question. Marshall, are there any additional questions?
Yes, there are. There are three more. The next one comes from Yana Ma, who wrote, I'm an immunologist. Is it possible for one to get a self-directed form of bioinformatics training? Can you recommend any such courses? How can one get started in the field?
So there's an increasing number of free courses. So some of these networks that I mentioned on their portals have online education. There are books in the field as well, and I've cited some of them as well. I think it's also eye-opening to go to a conference and network with other people and visit other labs. I think one of the best ways to sort of learn this is to actually join an existing lab. And so if you have an opportunity to spend 4 months or a year or get a degree, it'd be useful. But if you don't have time for a full degree, to visit another another lab. Our lab, for example, accepts visitors and no other ones from anywhere from 4 months or more to do research, and it's a really good hands-on way to learn. But yeah, there's an increasing number of courses available online. And even if you get a degree, you need to sort of pursue these online education and continuing education opportunities, because the methods and tools are changing literally every day.
Thank you, Yuri. And so for all the AllerGen researchers and trainees that are online, if you're interested in a lab exchange with centers of excellence in bioinformatics, talk to your supervisor or speak to Leah Greystone at the AllerGen Administrative Center, because we do have a program that will provide support for those kinds of capacity building opportunities. So thank you very much, Yuri, for the answer to that question. Marshall, next question.
The remaining two questions are both from Dean Beefus. I'll read them one at a time. The first of those two is, can you review some of the national and or multinational networks for birth cohorts with broad integration, including clinical data?
So birth data is difficult to get. Well, all data is difficult to get just because of the fragmented nature. There are research networks that have been doing this. Here, for example, at Boston Children's, there's several investigators involved in certain centers. Most of those, I'm not aware of something as large as the kinds of networks that I've shown here, like at the million person. Typically, children's research is funded at a lower funding rate than some of the adult diseases, but there are individual NIH-based studies, and some of those repositories are being made. If you look at the database link that I have for the efforts that the NIH and National Library of Medicine are doing, they are trying to make it easier to discover those databases that are accessible through their curation. So go to that slide, click on there. Patricia Brenneman, who is the head of the National Library of Medicine and who's also a nurse and an informatician, is doing a stellar job at lobbying different resource agencies to fund and increase that environment. So I'd start looking there as well.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Before I read Dean's last question, I see one of our attendees has raised his or her virtual hand. So I'm going to open the mic for that person to speak. And I apologize, I may mispronounce your name. Z-Man-Se, I think hopefully is an approximate pronunciation. I'm going to unmute you now so you can pose your question. Please go ahead.
Hi, that wasn't bad for my name. Thank you. My question actually, if I may, relates to your broader interest on health apps and health devices. I see them as valuable research tool because they can provide so much data, and health devices nowadays can measure blood pressure, heart rate, even lung function sometimes. But I was wondering, would you know how many of these health devices are actually clinically validated before we can use them for research? And if they're not validated, do you think that they need to be more rigorously validated before we can actually use them in research?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is in the United States a group within the FDA that is validating those devices if they are being used for diagnostic or therapeutic use. And so far, there's a handful of them that have submitted their data, and I think there was a few approvals. It's a fairly new, initiative. There is quite a bit of variation between sort of consumer level and clinically rigorous. And I know that some groups have actually just taken to their own efforts locally to sort of test different devices. But increasingly, these devices are becoming more accurate and they will become more affordable. But there's a handful of them, and if you email me, I'll send you a link to a few of them that I know. I think Europe is trying to develop similar standardization. One of the challenges is that to get it clinically approved takes a lot of time and effort and to collect data, and a lot of device companies, especially the startups, don't have the money to be able to submit it. So there may be some things that have been approved that are actually quite effective. And so it's still a buyer beware that you should sort of do your own due diligence to validate them as well.
All right, thank you. And Marshall, your final question submitted online.
Yes, this is again from Dean Beavis, and it's related to the last question to some extent. And he wrote, some publicly funded healthcare systems have been hesitant to pick up privately developed patient apps. Do you have any advice on standardization of such apps and their acceptance and integration into publicly funded healthcare systems?
So I always like to work at the cutting edge of technology and the things that are disruptive, and it's always been a challenge to sort of get a lot of those innovations accepted into the main fold. But at the same time, if people didn't work at that space, we wouldn't actually make progress. So it's a reality that if you're always enjoy the cutting edge, you're always going to find resistance. And so I would suggest anyone who's in that space to have long-term resiliency. The way you sort of get more acceptance is, one, to be able to share research studies where they have been able to validate it. I know that one of the major questions that a lot of hospitals and other systems have is sort of the sustainability of so apart from just the accuracy of the devices, is how to integrate them into clinical workflow and the cost of and security to connect to do real-time data sharing between that. Now, there is a technology called in the United States called Smart on Fire, which is making it easier to connect apps to medical records. So you write once to that FHIR standard and it connects to several different medical records. So it is becoming easier to connect. And I think you have to sort of make the really strong argument of what is the business value, not just the healthcare value that people improve healthcare outcomes, but there are always bean counters in any organization, and better care with better outcomes usually leads to lower savings, because there's less readmissions and better quality of life for patients. And so being able to quantify what is the return on investment, not only in the healthcare sense, but the financial side of it. And so partnering with people who are from the business school, who are public health schools, or to do the analysis. And lastly, I think there's just a sort of ideological resistance to change. And that you need to sort of be able to find change champions within organizations that are willing to sort of keep going through the process of getting approvals. We always in our division make our graduate fellows do projects, and of course they usually have to go through a committee to get approved. Sometimes there's lots of concern, you get relegated to a subcommittee, and so we always tell them this is where your real training begins, is after you learn to get through the committees. But persistence is, I think, important, having facts and tackling not just the healthcare outcomes, but financial and long-term benefits to do that. And I think over time, people will migrate. Once they see other organizations successfully integrating these smart sensors, mobile apps, and other things, and seeing better quality results, you'll see the success. I know that there are, for example, serious gains for health, for asthma, to help people with medication management. Tools are being used for symptom collection at home. And so increasingly, I think people will realize that, one, it makes not only healthcare sense in terms of outcomes, but it also makes financial sense. And so the final resistors, I think, will give up when there's more data on all sides to convince that this is the right way to go.
Well, thank you for that question, Dean. And Yuri, we're approaching 3 o'clock here at McMaster University, and our hour is nearly up. I feel like this afternoon we just skimmed the tip of the iceberg of your experience and expertise in this area, but your passion for informatics and its transformational potential to improve health outcomes and through better understanding and access to health information has really shone through, and I think we've all learned a great deal. So thank you so much for joining us.